He pulled out the chair for her like she was somebody, and the whole dining room went quiet enough that you could hear the chandelier candles hissing. Delia Pruett kept her eyes forward. She had learned a long time ago that looking down only gave people permission to keep pressing. The man who had gone still at the head of the table was Harlan Cross, the kind of man whose name got said in a certain tone in Cutter's Bend, the kind of tone that meant be careful and step aside and don't ask questions you can't afford the answers to. He owned the mill. He owned 3 of the 4 grain elevators. He owned, people said, the patience of the town judge, which was the same as saying he owned the judge outright. He had invited them, had sent word through his foreman on a Tuesday morning, a folded note on good paper delivered to the door of the boarding house where Delia had been staying since her father's death. The note said dinner, Friday 7 o'clock, formal. It didn't say please. Men like Harlan Cross didn't say please in writing. Beside her, Sheriff Tomas Aldridge pulled his own chair out and sat like he hadn't noticed a single thing. "Mr. Cross," he said, "thank you for having us." Harlan Cross looked at Delia the way a man looks at something that has gotten into his house without being invited, slowly, thoroughly, without hiding it. "I wasn't aware," he said, "that you'd be bringing the Pruett girl." There it was, the Pruett girl. Delia had been called that her whole life in this town. Not Delia, not Miss Pruett, not the young woman who had run her father's ledgers since she was 14 and kept the feed store from going under through 3 bad harvests. Just the Pruett girl. Like she was a condition to be managed. Tomas set his napkin across his knee. "Miss Delia Pruett," he said, his voice easy, no edge to it at all, "has been assisting me with the land deed records for the past 6 weeks. Anything we discuss tonight she'll need to be part of." Harlan Cross's jaw moved, but he didn't speak immediately. Across the table his wife, a thin woman in green silk, looked at Delia with an expression that was almost pity, and not quite. "She's a feed store girl," Cross said finally. "Her father owed debts to half this county when he died." Thomas looked at Cross for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Every man owes something when he dies. The question is what he built while he was living." He picked up his fork. "Your cook's made something that smells like brisket. Should we eat?" Delia did not look at Tomas. She couldn't, not yet, because if she did she would say something or feel something, and neither of those was useful right now. She looked at her plate instead, and thought, hold on, just hold on a little longer. Her father, Roy Pruett, had died in February, 3 weeks before the ground thawed. He had died in the back room of the feed store he'd owned for 22 years, in a chair that had a groove worn into the armrest from his elbow. The doctor said it was his heart. Delia thought it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting the same fight every single year and winning just barely, just enough, and then having to start over. He had left her the store. He had also left her something she didn't fully understand until the following week, when she was sorting through his papers and found the survey records. Her father had kept meticulous notes. He wasn't educated past the 8th grade, but he had a mind like a trap. Things went in and didn't come out in the wrong order. His ledgers were perfect. His correspondence was filed by date and by sender, and in a locked tin box under the floorboard of the back room, he had kept a separate set of records going back 11 years. They were land records, survey maps, deed transfer documents with dates and signatures, and alongside them, in her father's careful handwriting, a list of names, 23 families in and around Cutter's Bend who had lost property to foreclosure or forced sale over the past decade. With notes beside each one. Foreclosed Feb 1873. Cross Bank held note. Original survey says 480 acres. Deed transfer shows 310. Where did 170 go? Widow Calloway. Sold under duress April 1874. Witnessed by Harlan Cross's foreman. No independent counsel. Petition filed by Donnelly family dismissed. Judge Aldsworth. Delia sat on the floor of the back room for a long time after she read them. Then she read them again. Then she got up, put the tin box in her saddlebag, and rode the 6 miles to the county seat to find the sheriff. She had not expected Tomas Aldridge to believe her. She had not expected much at all. Maybe a polite dismissal, a suggestion that she speak to a lawyer, a kind and useless promise to look into it. That was what had happened to the Donnelly family. That was what had happened, she suspected, to everyone her father had listed in that box. Instead, Tomas had looked at the survey records for a long time. He had looked at the deed transfer documents. He had looked at the name Judge Aldsworth, written in her father's handwriting, and he had been very still. "How long did your father have these?" he asked. "I don't know. she said. The earliest entry is 1872. He never did anything with them. He was afraid, she said. It came out plain, without apology. He was afraid and he had me, and he didn't know who to trust. Thomas had set the papers down carefully. Can I keep these? No, she said. But I'll work with you. He had looked at her then, really looked, the way people rarely did when they were looking at the Pruett girl, and after a moment he nodded once. That had been 6 weeks ago. The brisket was good. Delia ate it because she needed to keep her strength, and because leaving food on the plate of a man like Harlan Cross was the kind of gesture he'd make a story out of later. She listened while Tomas steered the conversation toward neutral ground. The spring flooding on the Cutter River, the price of iron, the new post road going through. Cross relaxed, the way men like him always relaxed when they thought they were winning. His wife spoke about her sister in Galveston. The foreman, who'd been invited, sat at the far end of the table and watched Delia with careful eyes. His name was Lyle Dodd. He'd worked for Cross for 9 years and had witnessed or arranged, by Delia's father's count, at least 7 of the fraudulent land transfers. He wasn't the architect, he was the instrument. But instruments had memories. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and the good bourbon was brought out, Harlan Cross leaned back in his chair and looked at Tomas with the expression of a man who was about to say what he'd actually invited them here to say. There's been some talk, Cross said, about land records, old surveys, people stirring up trouble about things that were settled years ago. Is that right? Tomas said. I want you to know, Cross said, and he let his gaze drift to Delia just briefly, just enough, that anyone dragging up old business is going to find themselves in a difficult position, legally speaking, and otherwise. The room held. Delia looked at Harlan Cross and thought about her father sitting in that chair in the back room with 11 years of evidence, and not enough safety to use it. She thought about the Donnelly family and the widow Calloway and 21 other names written in careful handwriting. She thought about the groove in the armrest. Mr. Cross, she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised even her. I've spent the last 6 weeks at the county land office. I've cross-referenced your deed transfers against the original survey plats from the territorial records. I've found discrepancies in 11 separate transactions going back to 1872. She paused. I've also found the surveyor you used. His name is Emmett Pickett, and he's been living in Abilene for the past 4 years, and he has a family, and he has, I expect, a conscience. The silence was a different kind of silence now. Cross's face had gone through several things and had arrived at very still. You're a feed store girl, he said. I am, Delia said. My father taught me to keep accounts. I kept them. She had found Emmett Pickett through the surveyor licensing records at the state office, which she had written to in March. The letter had come back in April. 4 pages of archived registrations, and there was Pickett's name, his license number, his last known address filed in 1877 when he renewed. She had written to him. He had not written back immediately. He had waited 3 weeks, and then he had sent a letter in a plain envelope with no return address, and inside was a single folded page that said, I know what you're looking for. I'm not a brave man. But I have children and I don't want them to grow up with this on me. She had written back, you don't have to be brave. You just have to be precise. He had written back once more, what do you need? What she needed was an affidavit, a signed statement from the original surveyor testifying that he had been directed, by Harlan Cross by name, in specific conversations he could describe, to falsify boundary measurements on 17 separate parcels between 1872 and 1879. She needed dates. She needed acreage figures. She needed the names of the transactions and the amounts Cross had paid him. Pickett had sent it in May, notarized in Abilene, witnessed by a judge Delia had located through Tomas, a federal circuit judge named Harriet Voss's former clerk, now sitting in Amarillo, who had no connection to Cutter's Bend and no reason to protect anyone in it. The affidavit was in a lockbox at the county clerk's office in a town 30 miles east of Cutter's Bend, because Delia had decided that keeping it closer would be careless. She had filed a copy with a land attorney in Fort Worth. She had sent a 3rd copy to the state capitol. She had not told Tomas about the copies until after she'd sent them. He had looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. That was smart, he'd said. My father was careful, she'd said. I'm more careful. The morning after Harlan Cross's dinner party, a man came to the boarding house where Delia was staying and knocked on her door at 6:30. She was already awake. She had been awake since 4, which was how she slept when things were building towards something. The man was not someone she recognized. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that was trying to be harder than it was. He said, "Mr. Cross would like to speak with you." "Mr. Cross has my address," Delia said. "He can write, he'd prefer in person. Today." "I'm busy today," she said. "Tell him to write." The young man stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he said, quieter, "He's not asking friendly." Delia looked at him. He wasn't threatening her, not exactly. He looked, if anything, a little uncomfortable with himself. "What's your name?" she asked. He blinked. "Doesn't matter. It does to me." A pause. "Russ," he said. "Russ," she said, "you seem like a person who ended up in a situation that got bigger than you expected. I've been in that situation. My advice is to think carefully about what you do next, because the people you work for are running out of road." She paused. "Tell Mr. Cross I'll be at the county clerk's office at 9 o'clock if he wants to see me there, in public." She closed the door. She stood behind it for a moment, her hand flat against the wood, her heart going faster than she let anyone see. Then she straightened up and went to finish getting dressed. Cross did not come to the county clerk's office. Instead, 3 days later, Tomas received a letter from Judge Aldsworth, the same judge her father had noted in his records, stating that the sheriff's inquiry into land transfer records was irregular and potentially prejudicial and should be suspended pending review. Tomas brought the letter to Delia. He set it on the table in front of her and waited. She read it twice. Then she said, "He's running. It's a delay tactic," Tomas said. "It is," she agreed. "It won't work, but it'll buy him time if we let it." She folded the letter and handed it back. "Who does Aldsworth answer to?" "State appellate bench. Then we write to them, Delia. He's not a federal judge. He can be reviewed. He can be removed." She looked at Tomas. "I know this feels like hitting a wall. It's not. It's him telling us we're close enough that he's scared." Tomas was quiet for a moment. "You're very certain for someone who's been doing this for 6 weeks. "I'm certain because the math is right," she said. "I've checked it 6 times. The acreage doesn't add up. The dates don't match. The signatures are witnessed by the same 2 men on 9 separate occasions across 7 years. Either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of Cutter's Bend happened 11 times in a row, or Harlan Cross has been stealing land from his neighbors since before I was old enough to remember it." Thomas looked at her. "When did you eat last?" The question surprised her enough that she had to think. "Yesterday, noon." He stood up. "Come on. Mrs. Hartley's place is still open. We have work. The work will wait 20 minutes. He held the door open. "You can't run the math if you fall over." She stood slowly and picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She was not used to someone paying attention to that kind of thing. It disoriented her slightly, like a step she hadn't expected. They wrote to the appellate bench in Austin. The letter was 12 pages, signed by Tomas in his official capacity and accompanied by 3 exhibits, including excerpts from the survey discrepancy analysis Delia had prepared, which she had organized by parcel number, year, and recorded versus actual acreage. The response came in 17 days. Judge Aldsworth's inquiry order was suspended pending an independent review of his conduct. The review would be conducted by a circuit examiner out of Austin. The news moved through Cutter's Bend, the way news always moved through small towns, faster than wind and louder than it started. By the time Delia walked to the post office that morning, 3 people had looked at her differently. Not warmly, not yet, but differently. In the feed store, which she had kept running through all of this, opening at 7 every morning, because the farmers still needed seed and the accounts still needed keeping. Old Declan Morrow came in for his usual order and stood at the counter for a moment after she'd written up his receipt. "Your daddy," he said, "kept records on my parcel, the Aldsworth thing." Delia looked up. "I lost 40 acres in 1875, he said. Said I'd defaulted on a note I didn't know I had." He was looking at the receipt in his hands. "I always figured there wasn't anything to be done." "There might be now," she said carefully. "I can't make promises, but there might be." Declan Morrow folded the receipt into his breast pocket. He nodded once, the way men in this part of the country nodded when they meant something they couldn't quite say. Then he picked up his sack of seed and walked out. 2 days later, he came back with his neighbor. His neighbor came back with a brother-in-law. By the end of the week, Delia had 4 additional families who were willing to provide testimony about their land transactions. What they'd been told, what they'd signed, what they'd lost. She added their names to a document she was building. It was getting long. The hearing was held in August, in the county courthouse in Cutter's Bend, before the circuit examiner from Austin, a compact, quiet woman named Examiner Colleen Dre, who wore steel-rimmed glasses and took notes in a hand so small and precise it looked like typesetting. She did not seem impressed by Harlan Cross's lawyer, who was expensive and from out of town and used a lot of words. She did not seem unimpressed either. She simply listened and wrote things down. Delia testified for 2.5 hours. She had been terrified, walking into that room. She would not have admitted it to anyone. But her hands had been shaking slightly when she sat down, and she had pressed them flat on her knees, under the table, until they stopped. She looked at the survey maps she'd brought. She looked at the affidavit from Emmett Pickett. She looked at her father's records, which had been formally entered into evidence that morning, and which she had not been able to look at directly, without a particular tightness in her chest that she was managing very carefully. She started talking. She talked about acreage. She talked about deed transfer dates. She talked about the same foreman's name appearing as witness on 9 transactions across 7 years. She talked about the survey records and the discrepancy between what was filed and what the original plats showed. She talked for 2.5 hours, and she answered every question Examiner Dre asked her. And when Cross's lawyer tried to suggest that she was an uneducated feed store clerk with a grudge, she said, "The mathematics don't require education past the 8th grade. My father had that much, and so do I. The acreage is wrong. The dates are wrong. The signatures are the same. I've shown you all 3. Examiner Dre wrote something down. Cross's lawyer said, "No further questions." The examiner's findings came in October. Harlan Cross was referred for criminal prosecution on 14 counts of land fraud. Judge Aldsworth was removed from the bench pending an investigation into his conduct in 6 specific cases. Lyle Dodd, the foreman, entered into a cooperation agreement with the county prosecutor that nobody was surprised by, because Delia had been right about the instruments having memories. The land, not all of it, and not immediately, because these things are never simple and never fast, began to move back. It moved in the clumsy, paper-heavy way that legal remedies always move, through petitions and hearings and county filings and letters from attorneys. Declan Morrow got his 40 acres restored in November. 2 other families got settlements. The process for the remaining parcels was expected to continue into the following year. Delia was in the feed store when Tomas came to tell her about the Morrow land. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet, the kind of November day that smelled like cold earth through the open door. She was in the middle of reconciling the October accounts, and she had ink on her left hand from a pen that had leaked. He told her. She listened. She set down the pen. "Good," she said. And then, because she was alone with someone she had come to trust, which was still a new and slightly unsettling feeling, "My father would have been relieved. He would have been proud," Tomas said. She thought about that, about the tin box under the floorboard. About 11 years of careful notes kept by a man who was afraid but kept the records anyway, because he believed that truth written down was harder to destroy than truth only held in the mind. He would have said both things are the same, she said, relieved and proud. Thomas was looking at her. Not the way people looked at the Pruett girl. The way he'd looked at her since the beginning, since the first afternoon she'd laid the survey records out on his desk. Like she was someone who had brought something real and was owed a real response. "What happens to the store?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "Now. What do you do now?" She looked around at the feed store, the worn counter, the shelves her father had built by hand, the ledgers stacked in the back room where he had died in February in his chair. "I keep it," she said. "It's what he built." She picked up the pen. "But I've been corresponding with a land attorney in Fort Worth. There are more towns like Cutter's Bend, more records like my father's, more families who lost things they shouldn't have." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You're going to need to pass the bar," he said. "I know, that'll take. I know what it'll take," she said. She looked at him steadily. "I've always known what things take. I just never had the right reason before." Outside, the November wind moved through the empty street. A horse nickered somewhere down by the livery. The ledger was still open in front of her, the columns neat, the numbers adding up to exactly what they should. She picked up the pen again and went back to the accounts, and for the first time in a very long time, the quiet felt like something that belonged to her.